Yeah. So I think courage, and also one of the, that people who take risks often in fact have the ability to afford those risks, if you will. So for example, doing some dangerous athletic feat, if you're not an athletic person, you're going to fail at that. And so in some sense, some of these daredevil behaviors, I think, are kind of cues that you have the ability to afford to take those risks. But these guys, these high dark triad guys, are absolutely disastrous as long-term mates. So that they might be exciting for sure. I mean, that's why I think that women, as they mature, stop being attracted to these guys, especially if they're looking for a long-term mate, because these are guys, they're the dark triad, they're more likely to cheat. They're more likely to seduce and abandon. They're more likely to engage in deceptive mating tactics. And so they tend to be big trouble when it comes to long-term mating.
Yeah, well, it also looks like they value themselves greatly. And, sometimes people value themselves greatly. And so they have high mate desirability in your terminology, or maybe some little corruption of your terminology. And again, I think the dark triad guys mimic that. It's like, I'm so good, I can afford to, distribute my sexual prowess wherever I see fit. And there's some of that happens as men rise in competence hierarchies as well. Well,
yes.
It happens with women when they rise in their hierarchy. How do you understand? Here's a question I'd really like to hear you answer. How do you distinguish between female and male hierarchies for sexual selection? Because there are obviously women that are more desirable to men. So where are the big sex differences there? I know that women will mate across and up competence hierarchies, and men will mate across and down, roughly speaking. But there are other differences.
Yeah. So we recently published a study on 14 different cultures on the sex differences and similarities. And indeed, there are differences. So even things like physical attractiveness, it increases both male and female status, but it increases female status more than male status. Why? Well, what we argue is that, and this is one thing my 37 culture study showed, is that men place a greater priority on physical attractiveness, physical appearance, good looks. And it's not an arbitrary social construction. It's basically an evolved preference for fertility cues. Men who mated with infertile women failed to become ancestors. And so we're all descendants of...
I have to ask you this too. Here's something I really got in trouble for. So I was doing an interview with NBC reporter. I don't remember who it was, but he didn't like me at all. So he was trying to catch me out on all sorts of things. And we talked about makeup in the workplace. And I said that women use makeup to enhance their sexual attractiveness. And man, you wouldn't believe the flack I got for that. And I said, well, the reddening of the lips, for example, and the rouging of the cheeks is not only a signal to mimic youth and fertility, but it's likely associated with mimicry of ripe fruit, because our visual system evolved to detect ripe fruit. And if you look through any advertising, like any magazine, women's magazines in particular, the association between makeup and fruit is there in the imagery all the time. So, yes. and the flavor as well, for that matter. So, did I say something that I shouldn't have said? Am I wrong about that in some important way?
No, you're not wrong about it. But I know what you mean. I've gotten some flack for that as well. And I mean, one thing that, on this finding that men prioritize physical attractiveness, and that physical attractiveness is not just this arbitrary social construction, but in fact, underlying it is a set of cues to youth and cues to health, and hence cues to fertility. This is a very upsetting notion to some people. And so I was actually, even before I published the 37 culture study, I gave a talk on it to a sociology department when I was at Michigan. And a female professor came up to me afterwards and said that I shouldn't publish the findings. And I said, well, why not? Because to me, empirical findings are empirical findings, But she said that women had it hard enough without in competing with each other on physical appearance without being told that men have this evolved preference for it. And so the standard social science model is more comfortable for people to believe, oh, it's just arbitrary and infinitely changeable, and you go to, any different culture and they value a whole different set of things. And the notion that we have evolved preferences for fertility cues is anathema to some people.
Yeah, well, but you can understand it to some degree, because a lot of the truths that psychologists have stumbled over, let's say, are actually quite painful. I mean, I reviewed the IQ literature for about 20 years trying to get to the bottom of it. And it's very distressing to realize how wide the human differential is in cognitive ability. It's really quite a staggering thing to understand how broad that gap is and how much pain that causes, especially at the lower end of the distribution. And the fact that men are stringently selected for, let's say, the capacity to acquire a position in a competence hierarchy, and women are brutally punished in terms of their sexual attractiveness for not manifesting signs of fertility and youth. It's like there's a real harshness to that, but it's the harshness, I think it's the harshness of life. And actually understanding that makes it less harsh insofar as understanding is useful.
No, I would agree with that. And, I've stumbled across a lot of findings in my research, and we'll get to the issue of conflict between the sexes, that I find personally distressing, that I wish didn't exist, but they do. And so I feel similarly that, we're better off confronting our nature and the empirical reality, including sex differences in that nature, rather than just pretending that these features don't exist.
Well, we also should be very cognizant of the fact that the counterclaim, which is that, well, there are no biological what would you say, structures underlying our perception, sexual perception and otherwise, and our cognition. So we have no biological nature, which means we're infinitely amenable to social utopian schemes that are designed to turn us into a particular vision of human. And there's great danger in that too. So that's the other side of the coin. Yeah. There's danger everywhere.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is, implicit in those notions is that humans are passive vehicles rather than active strategists that can be easily manipulated by whatever, and that's not a very flattering view of humans. No,
and it's justified some rather wide-scale social engineering attempts in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
So it is a real danger. It's not. And that doesn't take away anything from the fact that there is such thing as unpleasant fact.
Yes.
So, and it's reasonable to be cognizant of that. So you were going to talk a little bit about, let's talk about violence, say, between men and women. One of the things I was struck by in your chapter on violence, the way it opened, I studied aggression for a long time in little kids, in elementary school children, adolescents, all the way up, developmental origins of aggression with Richard Tremblay in Montreal. And so I'm very interested in that. And I think often that psychologists have things backwards when we approach questions. So for example, we often try to explain anxiety instead of explaining its control, which is way harder to do because of course you're anxious. That's bloody obvious. Why aren't you terrified out of your skull all the time is the question. And I think it's the same with aggression. It's often treated as if aggression itself is something that needs to be explained. Whereas for me, the mystery is, well, no, aggression, not, of course. Yeah. The mystery is how we control it. That's the mystery.
Yeah.
And so,
and we do. I mean, it's, aggression is selectively deployed, and is very context specific. And I mean, it gets back to, it depends on, I don't know whether you studied physical aggression, but you were asking earlier about differences between male and female hierarchies. And one of the things that is well documented is that while men are higher in physical aggression, including all the way up to homicide, women engage in social aggression, or what's sometimes called relational aggression, where they shun someone or exclude someone or slut shame another woman. And so that's a form of aggression.
Yeah, reputation savaging.